Pony Express rider waited at the relay station. A bride with frozen feet rode in on his missing horse. The horse came in around 3 in the morning. I know the time because the lamp in the station window had burned down to the stub. I always lit at midnight, and it had maybe another hour of oil left in it. I'd been watching it, watching the door, watching the lamp, watching the dark square of the window for movement I knew probably wasn't coming. Ramai was the horse. Bay gelding, 6 years old, white stocking on the left foreleg. Fastest horse I had, which was why I'd sent him out with Luther Kane on the noon run 4 days ago and hadn't seen either of them since. Luther had been on this route 3 years and never gone more than a day past schedule without sending word. I'd ridden out myself the second day, as far as the Platte crossing, and turned back when the weather hit. By the third day, I had 2 horses left in the corral, a week's worth of mail sitting in the leather pouches on the wall, and nothing to do but wait and go over in my head all the ways a man doesn't come back. So when I heard hoofbeats, what I felt first wasn't relief. It was closer to the feeling you get when a thing you've been dreading finally walks through the door and at least the waiting is done. I got up from the chair, took the lamp off the hook, and went to the door. Ramai was standing at the corral gate, favoring the right foreleg some. He was lathered despite the cold, and his breath was a white cloud in the lamplight. The reins were hanging loose, and I could see the mail pouches were gone, not torn off, unbuckled careful, and there was someone on his back who wasn't Luther Kane. She was pitched forward over his neck with her hands wrapped into his mane like she'd held on that way for a long time, and her fingers had locked. When I got close enough, I could see she was a woman, maybe 30, dark hair plastered to her face, dressed in a traveling coat that was not made for this country or this weather. Light wool, good buttons, the kind of coat a woman wears to church in Missouri. I said, "Easy," to the horse first, then to her. "Easy, I've got you." She didn't answer. Her eyes were open but not looking at anything useful. I got her off the horse the way you'd take a sleeping child off a wagon seat, slow, carrying as much of the weight as I could manage, keeping her upright against my chest while her feet found the ground. That's when I felt it. Her feet hit the frozen mud, and she made a sound that came from somewhere deeper than her chest. Low and involuntary, the sound of pain she didn't have the strength to properly express. I looked down. She was wearing leather shoes, not boots. Shoes with a small heel, the kind of thing that might be sensible on a plank sidewalk in a city. They were soaked through, and the leather had gone hard and dark. I didn't stop to think about it or run through what it meant. You learn in this work that thinking and doing need to happen at the same time, or else you're just standing in the cold, with a problem getting worse while you contemplate it. I got her inside, got the door shut with my heel, and set her down in the chair nearest the stove. I put the lamp on the table where I could see, and I got her coat off and got the blanket from my bunk. Then I sat down on the floor in front of her and took off those shoes. The left foot was bad, the right foot was worse. I won't dwell on what they looked like because that part isn't the story. The story is what you do. I'd seen frostbite before. You work the Pony Express on the high plains in February, you see it. And I knew what needed doing and what didn't. And I knew the difference between what might heal and what probably wouldn't. I packed both feet in cool, not warm, cool water from the bucket I kept inside so it wouldn't freeze. I kept the stove going. I had willow bark in the kit, and I made a tea of it, and I sat and held the tin cup for her because her hands were still stiff. She drank about half of it before she started shaking, which was a good sign, the shaking. It means the body is still trying. She fell asleep in the chair. I tended to Ramai. His name, I should say, was Callum Das, though most people just said Das and let the first name sit. 44 years old. 6 feet and losing ground to the years in the back and the knees. 3 years on this particular stretch of relay station, the one between the Platte River crossing and the ridge the Shoshone called something I couldn't pronounce, which the men who set up the route had simply labeled Station 9 on the maps. Before that, 6 years as a rider before the miles started getting too long for the body, and before that, a decade of other things, some of which he didn't talk about. I'm telling it that way for a moment, the outside way about him, because I need you to understand what kind of man he was before I tell you what happened in the days that followed. He was a man who had organized his life around being useful in ways that didn't require witnesses. The horses knew him. The mail went through. The station was dry and the gear was maintained, and every rider who came through got a hot meal and a remounted horse and went on. That was the arrangement. Nobody stayed. Nobody was meant to. He had not had a woman in his house since he'd left Abilene, and that was 7 years back, and he didn't spend much time thinking about it anymore. She woke up toward morning. I was in the other chair by then, not sleeping, just not pacing anymore. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the stove, then at her feet which I'd wrapped in clean cloth, then at me. "Whose station is this?" she said. It wasn't quite a question, more like she was confirming a thing she was reasoning out. "Mine," I said, "Pony Express Relay, Station 9. She nodded. Her voice had some sand in it, but she didn't seem confused or lost. "The horse," she said. "He's fine, sore on the right front, but he'll come out of it." "He was the only horse left," she paused. "The others bolted when she stopped." "You don't have to tell it now." "I know that." She said it without sharpness, just as a fact. "I'm telling it because I want to. There were 3 men. They took the rider's pouches and his horse, the other one. The rider fought them." Another pause. "He didn't make it." "Luther," I kept my face the same. There was time for that later. "The bay was still tied," she said. "They didn't seem to notice him or didn't want him. I got loose and got on him. I don't know how long I rode. I kept him going north because that's what the rider had said, north to the station." "Luther told you that?" "Is that his name?" She said it flat, not a question either. "Was." She held that for a moment. "He was kind to me. He didn't have to be." I didn't say anything to that. I got up and checked the stove and put more wood in because doing something was easier than sitting still with what she'd told me. When I came back, she said, "My name is Nora Beale. I was on my way to marry a man named Gerhardt Futz in Laramie." I sat back down. "Was." She looked at me steadily. She had dark eyes, the kind that hold things without broadcasting them. "Was," she said. "I won't tell you I knew then. I didn't know anything. I was a man with a dead rider, a missing male, a woman with frost-bitten feet in my only chair, and 3 men somewhere in the territory who needed finding. That was the shape of my world that morning. It didn't have much room in it for the other kind of thinking. What I can tell you is what I did, because the doing is how I've always understood myself. I cooked. I had dried beef and hardtack and a tin of beans that were close to going, and I made a meal out of it that was better than it had any right to be, given the raw material. I refilled the lamp. I checked her feet again mid-morning. The right one concerned me. The 2 smallest toes had that waxy look. And I changed the wrapping, and she sat through it without making a sound, though I could see what it cost her by the set of her jaw. "You've done this before," she said. She meant the tending. "Some. Are you a doctor?" "No." She watched me work. "You're careful," she said, not a compliment exactly. An observation the way you'd note that a man's tools are in good order. Around midday, I sent a message by the single rider who came through on the south route, a boy named Elias, 17, who was so cold he could barely hold the reins. I told him what had happened to Luther. I told him to report it to the home station and get word to the marshal at Fort Kearney. He nodded and rode out, and I watched him go, and then I went back inside. She was sitting up straighter in the chair. She'd found my comb somewhere and done something with her hair, which I noticed without meaning to. "You're not going after them," she said. It wasn't a rebuke. She'd been reasoning it out. "Not today, when my relief rider gets here." "And when is that?" "Supposed to be tomorrow. Could be a week, weather like this." She nodded, and I can't ride. "No." "And you can't leave the station unmanned." "No." She thought about that, then, "That's a very tidy problem." "It is," I said. "It's a strange thing, being confined with someone. Strange the way a small space shapes a person different than a large one. Out on the plain, you're just 2 people in the same direction. Inside 4 walls with 1 stove and 1 window and a storm pressing against both of them, you become something else. Adjacent. Necessary. She slept the second night in the bunk, and I slept in the chair, which I'd done before, and my back remembered it sourly by morning. She didn't thank me for it, and I didn't expect her to. It was just the arrangement. The second day was the hard one for her feet, the way the second day is always the hard one with frostbite. The feeling coming back is its own kind of damage, and you can't do much for it except keep the tissue warm and give the person something to focus on other than what they're feeling. She focused on talking. Not idle talk. Not the kind of thing people say to fill silence. She talked the way a person does when they've been alone for a stretch with their own thoughts and need the counterweight of another mind. She told me about the town she'd come from in Ohio, a place called Millhaven, which she described as beautiful in May and miserable every other month. She told me about her father, who was a good man with bad judgment in business dealings, and about her mother, who had died when she was 12 and who she'd spent the subsequent years trying to resemble without knowing exactly what there was to resemble. She told me about the advertisement she'd answered, Mr. Gerhardt Futz, 38, prosperous cattleman, seeking a capable and willing woman for partnership in the building of a home. Partnership, I said. That's what he wrote. Not the usual word for it. No, she said. It's why I answered. The other advertisements said wife and domestically inclined, and one fellow said biddable. She said the word with a particular flatness. And Futch said partnership. He did, whether he meant it. She shifted in the chair, repositioned her foot. I'll never know now, I suppose. I didn't say anything. I was at the table working on a bridle that needed restitching, which it had needed for 2 weeks, and I'd finally gotten to. She watched me work for a while, then she said, "What about you?" "What about me?" "You've been here 3 years, that's what you said, and before that you rode." "That's right. And there was nobody." "It wasn't a question." I kept my eyes on the bridle. There was somebody in Abilene before I left. "What happened?" The needle went through the leather. She wanted a man who'd be somewhere I wasn't. Nora didn't say anything to that. She didn't offer up a consolation or a counter. She just let it sit there, which was the right thing, and I noticed it was the right thing. The relief rider didn't come the 3rd day. He came the 4th day, a man named Stedman, heavyset and apologetic, who'd been stuck 2 days at the crossing because a section of the ice bridge had given way. He took one look at the situation, me, the woman in the chair, the condition of things, and to his credit he didn't ask unnecessary questions. I told him what had happened to Luther. I told him the mail was gone and who to contact. He nodded and said he'd hold the station and I could go. I went to the back of the station where I kept the things I might need, and I took them out and laid them on the table. The Winchester, the Smith & Wesson that had belonged to my father, the spare ammunition, the canvas bedroll, the kit. I packed methodically, which is the only way to pack when you're thinking about other things. Nora watched from the chair. When I was done, I stood there for a moment. I don't know what I was waiting for. Permission, maybe, from the room itself. You get that way when you've been alone a long time. You start getting it from objects, from the weight of a space, from things that can't give it. "Das," she said. I looked at her. "When you find them," she said, "be careful." It sounds simple. It was simple. But the way she said it, not come back safe or good luck out there or any of the other things people say that mean they're thinking about themselves as much as you, the way she said it was like she was telling me I was worth the caution. Like care applied to me was a reasonable expenditure. I picked up the Winchester and went to the door. I had my hand on the latch. "Will you come back here?" she said. "After." I stood there with my hand on the cold iron of the latch. Outside, the wind was working at the corners of the building the way it always did, finding the gaps, testing the joints. Ramai was in the corral. The sky to the north was low and the color of a bruise. "You'll be on your feet in a week," I said. "I'd rather be here when that happens." It wasn't a promise exactly, but she nodded and I went. The 3 men were not hard to find, which is the thing about the high plains in February. There are only so many places a man can be. They'd gone to ground at a way station 20 miles east, a private trading post run by a man named Arv who I knew slightly and who I suspected knew better but had let them stay anyway. The marshal I'd sent word to met me on the road, a big man from Nebraska named Prentice, and we went in together. I won't narrate the retrieval in detail because that's not the story either, though I will say that 3 against 2, when you know the ground and they don't, is less unfavorable than it sounds, and that all 3 of them came out of it breathing, which is all I'd promised myself when I rode out. Luther's mail pouches were in the back room under a saddle blanket. I took them. I gave Prentice what he needed for the trial, and I got on Ramai and I rode back west. It took 2 days because there was a new storm and I went around it rather than through, and there were 2 nights camped in a draw with a fire that kept going out. The kind of nights that are just endurance. You don't sleep much, you keep the fire alive, you think about what's ahead. I thought about the station, the light in the window, the smell of the place in the morning. I thought about her saying be careful like I was worth it. I hadn't had that in a while, somebody thinking it was worth being careful because of me. I came back on a Wednesday, midday, clear sky after all the weather, the kind of cold that's clean rather than punishing. The smoke from the station stovepipe was going straight up in the still air, which meant the fire was tended well and the day was calm. She was standing in the doorway when I rode in. Not on both feet, she had a hand on the doorframe and she was favoring the right side the way you do when something's not fully healed. But she was standing, and she'd heard the horse and come to the door, which is its own kind of thing. I got off Ramai and led him toward the corral. She watched me from the doorway. Stedman was behind her somewhere. I could hear him inside. The toes, I said, without looking up from the gate latch. How are they? The two small ones on the right are still numb, she said. The rest I can feel. That's good. Yes. I got the gate open and led Ramai through. I was aware of her watching, not in a way that made me self-conscious exactly, more in the way that the lamp in the window had felt those first nights orienting. I came out of the corral and latched it and walked toward the station. She hadn't moved from the doorway. When I got close enough to see her face properly, she'd gotten some color back in the cold air, and she was looking at me in a way I didn't quite know what to do with, not right away. You brought the mail back, she said. She'd seen the pouches on the saddle. Luther carried it, seemed right to finish it. She was quiet for a moment. Her hand was still on the doorframe, but she was standing steady. Then she moved, just slightly, shifted her weight, opened the door wider, not stepped back to let me pass. Opened it like she was opening it for me specifically. I stepped inside. The days after that had a different quality. It's hard to explain without it sounding like more than it was, or less than it was, and I'm not sure which direction the error would go. Stedman stayed another 3 days, and then the next scheduled rider came through, and Stedman went with him, and it was just us. Just us is a strange phrase for two people who'd been strangers 2 weeks before, but it fit. She was up on both feet by the 9th day from when she'd arrived, slow and careful but upright, and she took over the cooking in a way that didn't feel like taking over, just like a thing that needed doing and she could do it. She was a better cook than I was, which I told her and which seemed to amuse her. You made it work with what you had, she said. That's not the same as good. No, she said, but it's not nothing. We talked in the evenings, not always about important things. Sometimes about the horses, which ones had what temperament, which ones she'd learned to read from watching from the window those days she couldn't go outside. She'd spent a lot of time at the window. She knew Ramai's habits better than some men who'd worked with him. I found myself saying things I hadn't said to anyone. Things about Luther, what kind of man he'd been, how he'd told the same 3 jokes so many times that they'd lost their punchlines and become something else, just a rhythm you waited for. Things about the work itself, what it meant to me to be the man who kept the horses ready, kept the mail moving, kept the station lit at night for whoever was coming in cold off the plane. The work no one watched, but that had to be done. She listened the way that feels like being heard, which is not the same as quiet attention. She'd say a word or two that makes sense or I can see why. And it wasn't filler. It was confirmation. It was someone saying asterisk, yes, that's a real thing, the thing you just said asterisk. One night I told her about the woman in Abilene, more than I'd said before. She'd wanted a different kind of life, a settled life, and I hadn't been able to give it to her or hadn't been willing, and I'd spent some years afterward not being entirely sure which one it was. Does it matter, Nora said, which one it was? I thought about it, maybe not. You're here, she said. You kept the station, somebody had to. It was a plain thing to say, but she meant it plain, not as consolation. As a fact of the world she'd noticed. She wrote to Futz. The letter was on the table one morning, and I saw it there and didn't read it, but she told me about it that evening. She'd written to release him from any obligation, told him she'd been delayed, and her circumstances had changed, and she wished him well with his cattleman's life and his partnership. I kept my face the same, but I was aware of something in my chest that was not quite steady. He may not accept that, I said. He doesn't have to accept it. It's my decision. She was at the stove, doing something with the coffee. I never promised him anything I can't take back. Some men wouldn't see it that way. She turned around and looked at me with a directness that I'd gotten used to, but that still landed square. I'm not asking for protection, Das. I'm telling you where I stand. I didn't say anything to that for a moment. "Where do you stand?" she said, is the question after that. The lamp was going. The stove was going. Outside was whatever temperature February makes when it's done trying to kill you and is just sustaining itself in the cold. The horses were in the corral. The mail would come through tomorrow with the next rider and he'd go on, and another would follow, and the work would continue the way the work does. I sat with her question for the length of time it took the lamp to flicker once and steady. Then I said, "I'd like you to stay." She held the coffee tin and looked at me. Her feet were still healing. Her coat, that wrong country coat with the good buttons, was hanging by the door where I'd put it to dry 2 weeks ago and she hadn't moved it. Ramai was in the corral and she knew his habits now. She'd stood in the doorway when I rode back in and she'd opened the door wider. "I know," she said, "I know you would." It wasn't a yes, it also was. I won't pretend the weeks after that were simple, because nothing on the high plains in winter is simple. There was a rider who came through in bad shape, kicked by a horse outside Gothenburg, ribs gone wrong on the left side, and I spent 2 days doing what I could for him before he was able to continue. Nora did more than I expected. She had steady hands and a clear head under pressure, and she didn't get out of the way when there was a thing that needed doing, which I knew was not nothing and told her so. There was the morning the north fence came down in the wind, and 2 horses got out onto the plain, and I spent the better part of the day getting them back. She had supper ready, and she didn't make anything of my being cold and short-tempered when I came in. Just put the food on the table and sat down across from me, and waited until the cold and the temper had eaten themselves out on the hot food and the quiet. There was the night she had a dream that woke her up. I don't know what it was about, I didn't ask, and I heard her from the chair and I stayed still and let her come to terms with it herself. And after a while she was quiet again, and in the morning she didn't mention it, and neither did I. And there was a Sunday afternoon in late February when the weather broke for a day, and the sun came out flat and silver over the snow, and she walked, properly, on both feet, with only the smallest compensation in her right side, outside, and stood in the yard and put her face up toward the light. I watched her from the door. She had her eyes closed and her face turned up and the light was on her, and she looked like she was answering a question she'd been sitting with for a long time. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough. She turned around and saw me watching, and she didn't look away or pull herself back. "It's cold," she said. "It is. But the light's something." "It is," I said. She walked back to the door. When she got close enough that I could have stepped aside but didn't, she stopped and looked at me with those level dark eyes. "I'm staying," she said. Simple as that. Not asking and not informing me exactly. Not either of those things. Just telling me something true about herself that also happened to be something I needed to hear. I put my hand on the door above her head, not to hold the door exactly, just to have something to do with the feeling that was in me. She reached up and put her hand on my forearm, just for a moment, the way you'd touch a thing to confirm it's real. Then she went inside and I followed. There's a thing about staying. About choosing to stay, I mean, not drifting into it because there's nowhere else to go. The day she'd ridden in on Ramai, I had 2 horses and a dead rider and a storm on the way, and I hadn't known any of it was going to happen. That's usually how life works, not like a plan, but like weather. You don't choose the thing that comes at you. You choose what you do with it. I've thought about that some in the years since. What you choose and what you don't, and where the line between them falls. Nora came in on my horse in the dark, and she was hurt and alone, and I did what I'd do for anyone who came through that door. I tended her, I kept the station, I did the work. That much wasn't a choice, not really. That was just what a man does. But then she was there, and she was the kind of woman who listened like she meant it and talked like she meant it and stood in her own place in a room and let you stand in yours. And none of that was what I'd arranged for or calculated. I'd arranged for solitude and horses and mail and no one staying. She stayed. I let her know I wanted her to. That's as close to a choice as I've made in my life, and I made it with both hands. The last thing I'll tell you is about a morning, maybe a month after she'd been on her feet. It was still cold, but the quality of the cold had changed. You could tell the season was shifting. Couldn't see it yet, but could feel it the way a horse feels a change in the air before you do. I was out at the corral before dawn doing the morning check, the thing I'd done 10,000 mornings alone. Grain, water, condition of feet and eyes and coat. Ramai was first, as always. He turned his head and looked at me, and I put my hand on his neck, and he didn't move away. I heard the station door, and I heard her footsteps in the frozen mud, that particular sound, her walk, which I knew now the way you come to know a sound that's part of your days. And she came up beside me at the corral fence and leaned on the top rail. She didn't say good morning. I didn't say it either. We just stood there in the gray pre-dawn looking at the horses. After a while, she put her shoulder against mine, not leaning exactly, just there. The sky was lightening in the east. Ramai moved toward the water trough, and the other horses followed him, and their breath was white in the cold air, 5 separate clouds that drifted up and disappeared. I put my arm around her, her shoulder against my side, and we stood there while the light came up on the station, on the corral, on the plane that went out north until it hit the sky. This was what I'd been keeping the lamp burning for. I hadn't known that, but she had ridden in on my horse in the dark, and I had done what needed doing, and she had stayed, and I had let her know I wanted her to, and here was the morning after all of it, which was worth the waiting. The light came up clear,